Welcome to the deep dive. So, you asked for a way to really get a handle on Anchiceratops, that pretty impressive dinosaur from the late Cretaceous, right? Without wading through tons of academic papers.
Yeah, quick but thorough look.
Exactly. So, we've gathered the Q stuff, classifications, how it was found, what it looked like, even the world it lived in. Our mission today is basically to pull out the most interesting, the most important bits about Anchiceratops.
And it's a good one to dive into because, well, even the name itself hints at how our understanding changes over time. Anchiceratops.
Right, let's break that down. Anchiceratops, it's Greek. You've got Anchi, meaning near, Kera's horn.
Familiar part for ceratopsians.
Totally. And ox face, so near horned face. And the reason Barnum Brown picked that name back in 1914, well, he thought it looked like it was sort of in between.
A transitional form.
Yeah, something near Ceratops, the big umbrella group for horned dinosaurs.
Yeah.
So the name itself tells you about the early thinking.
It really does. It shows how science is a process, right? We start with an ideal, find more evidence.
And the picture gets clearer.
Yeah.
Or sometimes more complicated. So, okay, what did this near-horned face actually look like? Let's get a quick picture.
Okay.
Think. Medium size for a ceratopsian, heavily built, walking on four legs, definitely a plant eater.
Found in Alberta, Canada.
Right, living around 72 to 71 million years ago. Size-wise, maybe about 4.3 meters. That's, 14 feet long? So decent size.
Like a large SUV or something.
Yeah, good comparison. And the really standout features. 2 long horns over the eyes.
The brow horns?
Yep, a shorter horn on the nose. And then this really amazing frill at the back of the skull. It's quite long and rectangular.
Not like the big round ones you see on Triceratops.
No, quite different. And it's got these chunky, triangular, bony bits sticking out along the edge. Really distinctive look.
And we're lucky enough to have found, about 10 or so skulls? Maybe more now.
Yeah, at least 10 incomplete skulls, which gives us a pretty good basis to talk about it. Which leads nicely into the discovery story, actually.
It always starts somewhere, doesn't it?
It does. So the first find was back in 1912. Barnum Brown, famous name in dino circles, his expedition was out along the Red Deer River in Alberta.
Classic dinosaur hunting ground.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And they found the holotype specimen. That's AMNH5251. The holotype is like the official reference specimen for the species.
The name bearer.
Exactly. And it was the back half of a skull, mostly that big frill. They also found a couple of other partial skulls around the same time.
So a decent start, but not the whole picture yet.
Not yet. But then, fast forward to 1924, Charles M. Sternberg, another big name, finds a complete skull. NMC 8535.
Much better.
Much better. Found near Morin, Alberta. Now here's the twist. Sternberg initially thought this skull was different enough to be a new species. So in 1929, he named it Anchiceratops longirostris.
Longirostris. Long snout.
Precisely. But, as often happens, people studied it more, compared it to Brown's finds.
And decided it was just variation within the original species.
Exactly. So, A. longirostris is now considered a junior synonym of A. ornatus. Same dinosaur, just a later name based on what turned out to be normal individual differences.
Which is actually really important information in itself, right? Understanding that range of variation.
Totally. Because those different skulls, the 10 or so we mentioned, they do show differences. Horn core size varies. The frill dimensions aren't all identical.
Which could initially make you think, are these different species? Different sexes?
Right. But the thinking now, especially backed up by a big study in 2012, is that most of this is probably ontogenetic disparity, basically, how the animal changed shape as it grew up.
From juvenile to adult.
And also just normal individual variation, like people, some taller, some shorter, same species.
And that 2012 study was key because it actually pulled together more fossil evidence than previously recognized, allowing for better statistical checks on that variation idea.
Yeah, it gave us a much more solid footing. So, okay, let's zoom in on that frill, because it really is one of the most defining things about Anchiceratops.
It's definitely eye-catching. That rectangular shape you mentioned is quite unusual compared to relatives like Chasmosaurus or Pentaceratops.
Very different. And it's not just the shape, it's the decoration. Those coarse, triangular, bony bumps along the edges, the epiccipitals, they're pretty wide and rugged looking.
Almost like big blunt teeth around the margin.
Yeah. It suggests the frill wasn't just a simple shield, maybe something more complex was going on. Display, perhaps?
Likely. And even those epicypitals, they vary a bit too, don't they? Especially the ones on the sides.
They do. The ones along the side edge, the oedipuscomosals, there can be anywhere from 5 to 9 of them on each side, typically.
So some individual variation there.
Yep. And what's neat is that the last one on each side, the most posterior one, is usually quite a bit larger than the others, almost rivals the ones on the back edge.
The epiparietals.
Right, the 3 larger projections across the back. But maybe the weirdest feature on the frill.
Ah, are you thinking of those knobs?
Exactly. Anchiceratops has this pair of bony knobs kind of on the back part of the frill on either side of the middle.
And they're super variable between specimens, right? Different shapes, different sizes.
Hugely variable, and they point outwards, sideways, really unique little structures. We don't see quite the same thing in other ceratopsians.
Adds to its distinctiveness. What about the holes in the frill? The fenestrae.
Good point. Compared to some of its chasmosaurine cousins, like Pentaceratops or Torosaurus, which have huge openings.
To save weight, presumably.
Right. Anchiceratops has relatively small parietal fenestrae. The holes in the main body of the frill are quite modest in size.
Interesting. Less weight saving, maybe more solid structure,
Yeah.
or perhaps related to muscle attachments or display areas.
Could be. And you can even see evidence of the blood supply on the frill surface. There are these deep grooves where arteries would have run both on top and underneath.
Wow, the level of detail preserved is amazing. So we have a good sense of the skull, but the rest of the body, that's where things get a bit murky, isn't it?
Yeah, this is a major point of discussion, maybe even controversy. It revolves around one specific specimen, NMC 8547, sometimes called CMN 8547.
The one Sternberg found in 1925.
That's the one. And it's incredible because even though the skull is mostly missing, it's basically the most complete ceratopsid skeleton ever found. The whole spine, right down to the last tailbone.
It should be a goldmine for understanding how it moved, its proportions.
You'd think so. But
Yeah.
here's the catch. The postcrania, that's everything behind the skull in NMC 8547, has some features that are a bit unexpected for a chasmosaurine like Anchiceratops.
Like what?
Well, it has more vertebrae than typical 74 total, a really long neck, partly because 4 of the neck vertebrae are fused together into a syncervical,
Oh,
a long pelvis, a surprisingly short tail, and really stout, robust front legs with big muscle attachment points, especially on the humerus.
that does sound a bit different. So what's the issue?
The big question is, does NMC 8547 actually belong to Anchiceratops?
Ah, how certain is the association?
That's the problem. Only a few bits of frill were found with this amazing skeleton. And those fragments, well, they also share some similarities with another ceratopsid that lived around the same time and place, Rhinoceratops.
Oh, right. So it could be an Rhinoceratops skeleton instead.
It's a distinct possibility. One idea put forward by Malin in a 2010 study is that maybe Sternberg assigned it to Anchiceratops because Rhinoceratops had literally just been described earlier that same year, March 1925.
So maybe its features weren't widely known or recognized yet.
Perhaps. So if NMC 8547 isn't Anchiceratops,
Then we don't really have much definite information about the body of Anchiceratops at all.
precisely. Our picture of its body shape, its locomotion, often relies heavily on this potentially misidentified specimen. It really throws a wrench in the works.
Wow, that highlights just how careful paleontologists have to be with associations. One uncertain link can change everything.
Definitely. So keeping that uncertainty in mind, let's talk about where Anchiceratops fits in the bigger dinosaur family tree, its classification.
Okay, so Barnum Brown back in 1914 knew it was a horned dinosaur, Ceratopsia. Pretty broad group.
Right. Then in 1915, Matthew put it in the family Ceratopsidae, and the same year, Lawrence Lamb actually proposed a subgroup, Eoceratopsinae, specifically for Anchiceratops and a few others known at the time.
Using phylogenetic analyses, these family trees, is how scientists try to map these relationships, right?
Exactly, though that Eoceratopsinae idea didn't really last long.
No, it fell out of use pretty quickly.
Ironically, in that same 1915 paper, Lama also coined the name Chasmosaurinae, the subfamily Anchiceratops is firmly placed in today.
So it belongs with dinosaurs like Chasmosaurus, Pentaceratops, Triceratops, the long-frilled ceratopsids.
Correct. Peter Dotson and Phil Curry formally placed it there in 1990, and most studies since then agree it's Chasmosaurine.
But where exactly within the Chasmosaurinae, that's been debated a bit more.
But yeah, the finer details. Many modern analyses suggest it's quite closely related to Rhinoceratops, the one we just mentioned possibly being mistaken for it.
Interesting connection there.
And often this pairing, Anchiceratops plus Rhinoceratops, comes out as being more derived than Chasmosaurus. Derived meaning sort of, More recently evolved, more specialized features further up the branch.
Okay, so a later evolving type of chasmosaurian.
That's one prominent view. But remember that 2012 study by
The
Malin?
one that looked at skull variation.
That's the one. Well, their phylogenetic analysis actually suggested something different. It placed Anchiceratops closer to Chasmosaurus.
So that would make it less derived, more basal.
Potentially, yes. More towards the base of that part of the Chasmosaurian tree. So, as usual in paleontology.
The picture's still developing.
That's
Research continues.
exactly. But generally, it's seen as a later Chasmosaurian, possibly close to Anchiceratops. Okay, let's shift gears to how it might have lived. It's paleobiology.
Right, what was life like for an Anchiceratops?
Well, first off, let's just put that Alongerostrus idea fully to bed. As we said, the features like the slender, forward-pointing horns and overall size, they're now seen as just part of the normal variation within Aornatus, not a separate species.
Okay, good to clarify. What about how common it was?
That's interesting, too. Compared to some other horned dinosaurs found in the same rock formations, Anchiceratops fossils are actually, well, relatively rare.
Not as abundant as, say, Edmontosaurus or maybe other ceratopsids nearby.
Correct. And where we do find them, often in places like the Horseshoe Canyon Formation or Dinosaur Park Formation, the fossils tend to pop up in sediments that suggest they were near coastal or marine environments.
Does that tell us anything about its lifestyle?
It's led to a hypothesis, yeah.
Right.
Maybe Anchiceratops preferred living in or near estuaries, those zones where rivers meet the sea.
Environments that maybe other big herbivores avoided.
Possibly. It could suggest it was a bit more of a generalist, maybe exploiting different food resources. Its diet would still have been plants like ferns, cycads, conifers. Flowering plants weren't dominant yet, but maybe it focused on different types found in those wetter coastal plain areas.
An interesting ecological niche.
Yeah.
What about the classic question? What were the horns and frill for?
Ah, yes. Even Barnum Brown, way back at the start, had thoughts on this. He didn't really see the horns and frill shape in Anchiceratops as being ideal for fighting off predators.
So not primarily defense.
He suspected it was more about sexual selection impressing mates and species recognition, telling other Anchiceratops, hey, I'm one of you, and look how impressive my frill is.
Which is a common interpretation for a lot of ceratopsian headgear these days.
It is. Though there was that more unusual idea proposed later.
The semi-aquatic thing.
Yeah, Juan Langston Jr. in 1959, he suggested maybe Anchiceratops spent a lot of time in the water. He thought the long snout could be like a snorkel in swamps, and the heavy frill acted as a counterbalance.
Like a hippo or something.
Kind of. Now, that idea has largely fallen out of favor for dinosaurs generally, but Malin in 2012 did sort of revisit it, specifically thinking about that controversial skeleton NMC 8547.
The one that might not be Anchiceratops.
Right. If that skeleton is Anchiceratops, its very robust limbs and powerful muscles could potentially fit with a lifestyle involving wading or spending time in water, even if the short tail clearly wasn't for swimming. It's speculative, though, especially given the uncertainty around the skeleton itself.
A lot hinges on correctly identifying that specimen. What about telling males from females? Any luck there?
There was a proposal back in 1990 by Thomas Lehman. He suggested maybe the different skull forms represented sexual dimorphism. The more slender Longerostrus type could be females, and the bigger, more robust ones with upright horns were males.
Makes intuitive sense, perhaps.
It does, but again, Malin's 2012 statistical analysis didn't really support it. When he plotted out the features of all the known skulls, they didn't fall into two neat clusters, male and female.
More like a continuous range of variation.
Exactly, suggesting it was just individual variation, maybe related to age or just natural differences, not distinct sexes. So that idea was also rejected based on the available evidence.
Okay, so one last really intriguing aspect from that 2012 study, its longevity.
Yeah, this is super interesting. This study suggested that Anchiceratops, or Nodus, as a species, seems to have been around for a remarkably long time compared to many other ceratopsid species.
How long are we talking?
Well, many ceratopsid species seem to have existed for maybe only a few 100,000 years before being replaced or evolving into something else. Anchiceratops might have persisted for significantly longer within its environment.
Wow.
Yeah.
What could explain that kind of success?
That's the million-dollar question. Could it tie back to that potential preference for estuarine environments? Did that niche give it some resilience against environmental changes that affected other dinosaurs more? We don't know for sure, but it's fascinating to think about.
It really paints Anchiceratops as potentially quite adaptable, maybe occupying a unique spot in its ecosystem and managing to thrive for a good long while. So let's talk more about that ecosystem, the paleo environment.
Okay. Most Anchiceratops fossils come from the Horseshoe Canyon Formation in Alberta. We're talking late Campanian stage, late Cretaceous, around 72 to 71 million years ago.
And what was that area like back then?
It was a terrestrial setting, but heavily influenced by the western interior seaway, that big inland sea that was starting to retreat. So you had a real mix of landscapes right near the coast.
Like what sort of habitats?
Think meandering river channels, straighter channels, peat swamps, deltas dumping sediment into the nearby sea, broad floodplains, shorelines, lagoons, tidal flats. A really dynamic coastal plain environment.
Sounds wet. What was the climate like?
Generally wet and warm, temperate to subtropical. Although right near the end of the Campanian heading into the Maastrichtian, evidence suggests things started to cool down and dry out a bit. A noticeable shift.
Okay. And who else was living there alongside Anchiceratops?
Oh, a fantastic cast of characters. You had bird-like oviraptorosaurs like Epicurusnodes, fast-running ornithomimes like Ornithomimus.
The ostrich mimics?
Yep. Thick-headed pachycephalosaurs like Spherophilus, loads of duck-billed hadrosaurs, especially Edmontosaurus regalis. They were super common.
The cows of the Cretaceous.
Pretty much. You also had other horned dinosaurs around, like Pachyrhinosaurus canadensis, and the top dog, the apex predator, was the Tyrannosaur albertosaurus sarcophagus.
A formidable neighbor.
Definitely. And it wasn't just dinosaurs.
That's the whole ecosystem.
You had reptiles, amphibians, lots of fish in the waters, sharks, rays, sturgeon, gar. Turtles and crocs were present, but maybe not as diverse as in some other places or times. Initially thought to be climate, but maybe soil drainage played a role too.
Interesting.
We even find remains of marine reptiles like the Plesiosaur larispondylus in associated marine sediments. Freshwater habitats had things like Champsosaurus, a crocodile-like reptile, and crocs themselves like Lediasuchus.
And mammals.
Yep, early mammals were scurrying around too. Things like multituberculates and the opossum-like Didelphodon. Plus we have trace fossils footprints.
Oh, cool. What kinds?
Tracks of theropods, ceratopsians, maybe even Anchiceratops itself, and ornithopods. Confirms they were all walking around this vibrant, changing landscape.
It really sounds like a complex and dynamic world Anchiceratops was part of. Major environmental shifts happening, lots of neighbors.
Absolutely. A really rich picture. Okay, so let's try and wrap up our deep dive on Anchiceratops. Let's quickly hit the main takeaways.
All right. We started with the name near-horned face, reflecting early ideas about its place in the family tree.
We talked about its very unique look, that rectangular frill with the big triangular epicypitals and those weird variable knobs on the back.
Then the big question mark over the postcranial skeleton, that amazing NMC 8547 specimen that might, or might not, be Anchiceratops.
Right, and how that impacts our understanding of its body. We looked at its classification within the Chasmosaurinae, likely close to our Noceratops, but with some debate still happening.
We considered its lifestyle, the relative rarity, the possible preference for coastal estuarine areas, and how the frill and horns were likely more for show and recognition than pure defense.
And we just painted a picture of that late Campanian world in Alberta, the diverse habitats, the changing climate, and all the other creatures it shared its home with. Plus, that intriguing idea that it might have been a particularly long-lived species.
So a lot packed into one dinosaur. As we finish up, what's a final thought for you, our listener, to chew on?
Ooh, good question. Maybe. Given all the uncertainty, especially around that skeleton and the hints of a different lifestyle, what's the most surprising thing we might eventually discover about Anchiceratops' behavior? Could it have been doing something totally unexpected?
Or perhaps, thinking about its longevity, what specific adaptations or environmental factors allowed Anchiceratops to persist for potentially so much longer than many of its relatives? What was its secret to success?
Great questions to ponder. We hope this deep dive gave you a good handle on this fascinating horned dinosaur. Thanks for joining us.